In a shocking revelation, a single art forgery ring was busted in 2016, exposing over 2,000 fake artworks that had been sold to collectors and museums across the globe, with estimated losses totaling over $200 million. The sheer scale of this operation raises questions about the integrity of the art world and how such a massive scam could go undetected for so long. This wasn't just a case of a few rogue artists churning out fake masterpieces. It was a sophisticated network that included skilled forgers, corrupt dealers, and even some respected members of the art community. The core mystery here is how these forgeries managed to infiltrate the highest echelons of the art world, often passing as genuine works by famous artists like Picasso, Warhol, and Monet. The forged artworks were so convincing that even experts were fooled, and it's only through meticulous investigation and forensic analysis that the truth began to unravel. But what's even more disturbing is that this wasn't an isolated incident. It's just one of many cases of large-scale art forgery that have come to light in recent years. As we delve deeper into this world, it becomes clear that the problem of art forgery is far more pervasive and complex than initially meets the eye. The trail of clues leads us to the small town of Savona, Italy, where a group of skilled artisans had been producing remarkably convincing forgeries of modern and contemporary art. These weren't just crude copies. They were meticulously crafted to mimic the style, technique, and even the aging process of the original artworks. The forgers used high-quality materials, often sourced from the same suppliers as the original artists, and they even went so far as to create fake provenance and documentation to support the authenticity of the works. But that wasn't the strangest part. It was the fact that many of these forgeries had been sold to reputable dealers and collectors, who in turn had sold them to museums and private collectors, often at inflated prices. As we dig deeper, we start to uncover a web of deceit and corruption that reaches far beyond the small town of Savona. We find that the forgers had connections to a network of shady dealers and middlemen who were willing to look the other way in exchange for a cut of the profits. These dealers would often use their reputation and influence to authenticate the forgeries, providing fake certificates of authenticity and even staging fake exhibitions to create a veneer of legitimacy. But what's even more alarming is that some of these dealers were not just small-time operators. They were respected members of the art community, with ties to major museums and galleries. The investigation also reveals a disturbing lack of transparency and accountability in the art world. Many dealers and collectors are reluctant to disclose the provenance of the artworks they sell, making it difficult to track the ownership history and verify the authenticity of the works. This lack of transparency creates a perfect environment for forgers to thrive, as it allows them to create fake artworks and sell them to unsuspecting buyers without fear of detection. But that's not all. The art world's emphasis on confidentiality and discretion also makes it difficult for law enforcement to track down and prosecute those involved in the forgery rings. As we follow the trail of clues, we start to uncover a pattern of behavior that suggests a much larger and more organized network of forgers and dealers. We find that many of the forgeries are not just isolated incidents. They are part of a larger strategy to flood the market with fake artworks, driving down the value of genuine pieces and creating a false sense of scarcity. This is a classic tactic used by organized crime groups, who often use forgery as a way to launder money and fund other illicit activities. But what's even more disturbing is that some of these groups may have ties to terrorist organizations, using the proceeds from art forgery to fund their operations. The more we learn about the world of art forgery, the more we realize that it's not just a matter of a few rogue individuals. It's a symptom of a much deeper problem. The art market is a multi-billion-dollar industry, with a lack of regulation and oversight that creates a perfect environment for corruption and deceit. As we continue to investigate, we start to uncover a complex web of relationships between dealers, collectors, and museums, all of whom are complicit in the creation and perpetuation of this fake art market. But that's not the only thing that's disturbing. It's the fact that many of these individuals are willing to look the other way, even when they suspect that something is amiss, in order to protect their own interests and reputations. The fact that so many respected members of the art community are involved in this scandal raises serious questions about the integrity of the art world. How can we trust that the artworks we see in museums and galleries are genuine when even the experts can be fooled? And what about the collectors who have unknowingly purchased forgeries? Will they ever be able to recover their losses? Or will they be left to absorb the financial and emotional blow of being duped? As we delve deeper into this world, we start to realize that the problem of art forgery is not just a matter of individual cases. It's a systemic issue that requires a fundamental overhaul of the way the art market operates. But the story doesn't end there. As we continue to investigate, we start to uncover evidence of a much larger conspiracy, one that reaches the highest echelons of the art world. We find that some of the most respected dealers and collectors are not just victims of the forgers. They are actually complicit in the creation and sale of the fake artworks. They use their influence and reputation to authenticate the forgeries, and they often work together to create a false sense of scarcity and value. This is a shocking revelation, one that raises serious questions about the integrity of the art world and the people who operate within it. But that's not the only thing that's shocking. It's the fact that this conspiracy may be just the tip of the iceberg, and that there may be many more forgeries and scandals waiting to be uncovered. To understand how deep this iceberg goes, you first have to dismantle a common myth: the idea that art forgery is a victimless crime committed by lonely, starving geniuses operating out of dusty garrets. That romanticized image belongs in fiction. In reality, modern art forgery is an industrial enterprise, a high-stakes game of financial engineering where the canvas is merely a financial instrument, and the brush in this high-stakes game is wielded not by a lone forger, but by a network of skilled artisans, often working under the direction of masterminds with deep pockets and a keen understanding of the art market. These individuals are not the stereotypical struggling artists, but rather savvy businesspeople who have turned art forgery into a lucrative industry. They operate with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each component playing a crucial role in the creation and distribution of fake artworks. From the forgers, who meticulously recreate the style of renowned artists, to the dealers who peddle these counterfeits to unsuspecting collectors, every player in this syndicate is driven by one thing: profit. But what makes this industry so robust, so resilient to law enforcement efforts? The answer lies in its ability to adapt, to evolve with the times. Modern art forgery has become a digital affair, with forgers using cutting-edge technology to create near-perfect replicas of famous works. They study the chemical composition of the paints used by the masters, replicate the exact canvas weave, and even artificially age the pieces to give them a patina of authenticity. It's a level of sophistication that has left many in the art world stunned, wondering how such deception could occur right under their noses. But that wasn't the strangest part. The real astonishment comes from the realization that these forgeries are not just sold to naive collectors. They are also being bought by some of the most respected institutions in the world. These institutions, with their vast resources and teams of experts, should be the last line of defense against art forgery. Yet time and again, they have been duped, purchasing and showcasing fake artworks as if they were genuine. The reasons for this are complex, involving a mix of human error, the pressure to acquire new pieces, and the inherent difficulty in verifying the authenticity of a work of art. But the consequence is clear. It legitimizes the forgery, giving it a stamp of approval that can significantly increase its value. This, in turn, fuels the syndicate, encouraging them to produce more forgeries, further muddying the waters of the art market. It's a vicious cycle, with the potential to undermine the very foundations of the art world. As we delve deeper into this shadowy world, we begin to uncover the extent of the syndicate's reach. It's not just about creating and selling forgeries. It's about manipulating the market, creating a false narrative around an artist's work to drive up prices. This can involve flooding the market with fake pieces, thereby artificially increasing demand, or creating false provenance for a work, crafting a believable history to make it seem more valuable. The level of deceit is staggering, with some forgers even going so far as to create fake documents, such as letters from the artist or receipts from past sales, to bolster the legitimacy of their creations. But how do they manage to evade detection for so long? The answer lies in the lack of international cooperation and the fragmented nature of the art market. The art market is notoriously opaque, with many transactions occurring privately, away from the public eye. This secrecy, combined with the lack of a centralized database for art sales, makes it incredibly difficult to track the movement of artworks, genuine or otherwise. Furthermore, the legal system often struggles to keep pace with the syndicate's sophistication, with laws varying significantly from country to country. This creates a patchwork of jurisdictions, each with its own approach to tackling art forgery, allowing the syndicate to exploit these weaknesses, operating in the shadows, always staying one step ahead of the law. But that's not the only challenge. The art world itself is complicit in this opacity, with many preferring to deal with the issue discreetly, to avoid tarnishing the reputation of the art market as a whole. This preference for discretion over transparency has significant implications. It means that when a forgery is discovered, it's often dealt with quietly, without fanfare, to avoid alarming collectors and damaging the market. While this approach may protect the short-term interests of dealers and collectors, it does nothing to address the underlying issue, allowing the syndicate to continue its operations, unabated. It's a delicate balance, with the art world walking a fine line between protecting its reputation and facilitating the very criminal activity it seeks to condemn. But as we continue to peel back the layers of this complex issue, we find that the problem goes even deeper, touching on issues of cultural heritage and national identity. Art, in many ways, is a reflection of our shared human experience, a tangible link to our past. When forgeries infiltrate this world, they not only deceive collectors and undermine the market, but also distort our understanding of history. They insert false narratives into the cultural record, threatening the integrity of our collective heritage. It's a realization that raises fundamental questions about the value we place on authenticity and the measures we are willing to take to protect it. But that's a discussion for another time. For now, it's enough to acknowledge that the stakes are higher than mere financial loss. They involve the very fabric of our cultural identity. And it's here, in the intersection of art, crime, and culture, that we find the true extent of the Shadow Syndicate's influence, an influence that reaches far beyond the confines of the art world. As we delve deeper into the world of international art forgery, it becomes increasingly clear that the Shadow Syndicate's influence extends far beyond the art market itself. The forgers, often masters of their craft, have been known to create pieces that are so convincing, they deceive even the most discerning experts. But what's even more astonishing is the level of sophistication and organization that goes into creating these forgeries. From the creation of fake provenance documents to the meticulous recreation of an artist's style, every detail is carefully considered to ensure the forgery is indistinguishable from the real thing. But that wasn't the only surprising aspect of these operations, for it's in the way they are able to infiltrate the highest echelons of the art world that we find the true extent of their influence. The art market, with its lack of regulation and transparency, provides the perfect breeding ground for these forgers to operate. The anonymity of online marketplaces and the use of shell companies make it nearly impossible to track the origin of a piece, allowing forgeries to be sold alongside genuine works of art. And it's not just the buyers who are at risk. Even reputable galleries and museums have fallen victim to these forgeries. The case of the Beltracchi affair, in which a German forgery ring sold over 40 fake paintings to prominent galleries and collectors, is a stark reminder of the syndicate's reach. But what's even more troubling is the fact that many of these forgeries remain undetected, hanging in museums and private collections, waiting to be discovered. The question then becomes, how many more are out there, and what does this mean for the integrity of our cultural heritage? As we continue to unravel the threads of the Shadow Syndicate, we find ourselves entangled in a web of complexity and deception. The forgers, often charismatic and persuasive individuals, have a talent for convincing others of the authenticity of their creations. They use every trick in the book, from creating fake certificates of authenticity to enlisting the help of corrupt experts. But it's the way they are able to manipulate the system, to exploit the weaknesses in the art market, that's truly alarming. The use of online platforms, social media, and other digital tools has made it easier than ever for forgers to reach a global audience, to create a sense of urgency and scarcity around their creations. And it's here, in the digital realm, that we find the Shadow Syndicate's influence at its most insidious. But that's not the only place where their influence is felt, for it's in the very fabric of our society that we find the most disturbing aspect of their operations. The Shadow Syndicate's activities have far-reaching consequences, extending beyond the art world to affect our culture and society as a whole. The proliferation of forgeries has led to a situation where it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between what's real and what's not. This has significant implications for our understanding of history, our cultural identity, and our collective memory. The fact that many of these forgeries are being passed off as genuine works of art, influencing our perception of the past and shaping our understanding of the present, is a sobering thought. And it's here, at the midpoint of our investigation, that we come to a pivotal realization. The Shadow Syndicate's influence is not just limited to the art world, but is in fact a symptom of a much larger problem. The lack of regulation, the absence of transparency, and the greed that drives the art market have created a perfect storm, allowing the Shadow Syndicate to thrive. But what's even more surprising is the fact that there are those within the art world who are aware of the syndicate's activities, yet choose to turn a blind eye. The art world's complicity in the Shadow Syndicate's activities is a complex and multifaceted issue. On one hand, there are those who are genuinely unaware of the forgeries, who are duped by the syndicate's sophisticated tactics. But on the other hand, there are those who are aware, yet choose to do nothing, either out of fear or greed. The fact that many galleries and collectors are more concerned with the potential financial loss than with the integrity of the art itself is a damning indictment of the system. And it's here, in the silence of those who know, that we find the greatest obstacle to exposing the Shadow Syndicate. For in a world where secrecy and anonymity are paramount, it's those who are willing to speak out who hold the key to unlocking the truth. But that's not the only challenge we face, for as we delve deeper into the world of international art forgery, we find ourselves confronting a daunting question. How do we stop the Shadow Syndicate, and what does the future hold for the art world? The answer to this question is complicated, and one that requires a fundamental shift in the way we approach the art market. It requires greater transparency, greater regulation, and a commitment to authenticity. It requires those within the art world to take a stand, to speak out against the Shadow Syndicate, and to demand change. And it's here, in the face of this uncertainty, that we find a glimmer of hope. For despite the Shadow Syndicate's influence, despite the complexity and deception, there are those who are working tirelessly to expose the truth. From the forensic experts who use cutting-edge technology to detect forgeries, to the investigators who follow the trail of clues, to the whistleblowers who risk everything to speak out, there are those who are fighting back. And it's their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs that will ultimately lead us to the truth, and to a deeper understanding of the Shadow Syndicate's true extent. But that's a story for another part of our investigation. For now, let's just say that the truth is out there, waiting to be uncovered. As we delve deeper into the world of international art forgery, it becomes increasingly clear that the Shadow Syndicate's reach is far more extensive than initially thought. In fact, recent investigations have uncovered a trail of fake artworks that spans across multiple continents, with some pieces even finding their way into prestigious museums and private collections. But what's perhaps most alarming is the level of sophistication and coordination involved in these forgeries, suggesting a high degree of planning and execution. The fact that these fake artworks have been able to evade detection for so long raises serious questions about the effectiveness of current authentication methods and the vetting processes used by institutions and collectors. One of the most significant challenges in combating art forgery is the lack of transparency and consistency in the art market. Unlike other industries, the art world is largely unregulated, with many transactions taking place privately and without public disclosure. This lack of transparency creates an environment in which forgeries can thrive, as it's often difficult to track the provenance of a piece or verify its authenticity. Furthermore, the art market's emphasis on confidentiality and discretion can make it difficult for investigators to gather information and build cases against suspected forgers. But that wasn't the strangest part. As our investigation dug deeper, we found that some of the most prominent art dealers and collectors were actually aware of the forgery problem, yet chose to turn a blind eye, prioritizing profits over integrity. The case of the notorious forger, Wolfgang Beltracchi, serves as a prime example of the Shadow Syndicate's brazenness and the art world's complicity. Beltracchi, a German artist, forged numerous works by famous artists, including Max Ernst and Heinrich Campendonck, and sold them to unsuspecting collectors and institutions. What's striking about Beltracchi's case is not only the sheer number of forgeries he produced, but also the fact that many of his fake artworks were authenticated by leading experts and sold through reputable galleries. This raises serious questions about the reliability of expert opinions and the role of galleries in perpetuating the forgery problem. Moreover, Beltracchi's ability to operate undetected for so long highlights the need for more rigorous authentication methods and greater scrutiny of the art market. As we examined the Beltracchi case further, we discovered a complex web of connections between forgers, dealers, and collectors. It appears that Beltracchi was not working alone, but rather was part of a larger network of individuals who collaborated to create and sell fake artworks. This network, which included art historians, conservators, and other experts, used their knowledge and credentials to legitimize the forgeries and deceive potential buyers. The level of coordination and cooperation involved in these schemes is staggering, and it's clear that the Shadow Syndicate is a highly organized and sophisticated operation. But what's even more disturbing is the fact that some of these individuals have managed to maintain their reputations and continue to work in the art world, despite being implicated in the forgery scandal. The economic implications of art forgery are also significant, with estimates suggesting that up to 20% of the artworks in circulation are forgeries. This not only undermines the integrity of the art market, but also has serious financial consequences for collectors and investors who unknowingly purchase fake artworks. In some cases, the financial losses can be catastrophic, with collectors losing millions of dollars on a single piece. The emotional toll of being duped by a forgery can also be devastating, as collectors often form strong emotional bonds with the artworks they acquire. But that's not the only way the Shadow Syndicate is affecting the art world. As our investigation continued, we found that the forgery problem is also having a profound impact on the art historical record, with fake artworks threatening to undermine our understanding of art history itself. The art historical record is a delicate and complex thing, and the introduction of fake artworks can have far-reaching consequences. When a forgery is discovered, it's not just the individual piece that's affected, but also the entire narrative surrounding the artist and their work. In some cases, the discovery of a forgery can even lead to a reevaluation of an artist's entire oeuvre, as scholars and historians struggle to separate the genuine works from the fake ones. This can be a painstaking and contentious process, with different experts often having different opinions about the authenticity of a particular piece. But what's perhaps most concerning is the fact that some forgeries have become so ingrained in the art historical record that they are now widely accepted as genuine, even though they're actually fake. As we explored the art historical implications of forgery, we began to notice a disturbing trend. It appears that some art historians and scholars are actually contributing to the forgery problem, either intentionally or unintentionally, by authenticating fake artworks or failing to scrutinize the provenance of the pieces they're studying. This can be due to a variety of factors, including pressure to publish, lack of resources, or simply a desire to advance one's career. But the consequences of such actions can be severe, as they help to perpetuate the Shadow Syndicate's activities and undermine the integrity of the art historical record. But that's not the only way the Shadow Syndicate is infiltrating the academic world. As our investigation continued, we found that some universities and research institutions are actually providing a haven for forgers and their accomplices. The connection between the Shadow Syndicate and academic institutions is a complex and troubling one. It appears that some universities and research institutions are unwittingly providing a platform for forgers to operate, either by employing them as faculty members or by providing them with access to resources and expertise. In some cases, these institutions have even helped to legitimize the forgeries by providing them with a veneer of academic credibility. This can be devastating for the academic community, as it undermines the trust and integrity that are essential to scholarly research. Moreover, it highlights the need for greater scrutiny and accountability within the academic world, particularly when it comes to the study and authentication of artworks. As we dug deeper into the connection between the Shadow Syndicate and academic institutions, we encountered a number of surprising contradictions. On the one hand, many universities and research institutions are actively working to combat art forgery through initiatives such as forensic analysis and provenance research. On the other hand, some of these same institutions are also providing a haven for forgers and their accomplices, either intentionally or unintentionally. This contradiction highlights the need for greater awareness and vigilance within the academic community, as well as a more nuanced understanding of the complex relationships between forgers, dealers, and collectors. But what's perhaps most striking about this contradiction is the fact that it's not just limited to the academic world. As our investigation continued, we found that similar contradictions exist within the law enforcement community as well. The law enforcement response to art forgery is a complex and often frustrating one. On the one hand, there are many dedicated and skilled investigators who are working tirelessly to combat the Shadow Syndicate and bring forgers to justice. On the other hand, the lack of resources and expertise within law enforcement agencies can make it difficult to investigate and prosecute art forgery cases effectively. Moreover, the international nature of the Shadow Syndicate can make it challenging to coordinate efforts across borders and jurisdictions. But that's not the only challenge facing law enforcement. As our investigation continued, we found that the Shadow Syndicate is also using sophisticated tactics to evade detection and stay one step ahead of the authorities. The Shadow Syndicate's ability to adapt and evolve has led to a cat-and-mouse game between law enforcement and the forgers. One of the most significant challenges is the syndicate's use of digital technology to create and distribute fake artworks. With the rise of online marketplaces and social media, it's become increasingly easy for forgers to reach a global audience and sell their counterfeit pieces to unsuspecting collectors. But what's even more alarming is that these digital platforms are also being used to launder money and fund other illicit activities. As we dug deeper, we found that some of these online marketplaces are knowingly or unknowingly facilitating the sale of fake artworks, often with little to no vetting or authentication processes in place. This lack of oversight has created a perfect storm for the Shadow Syndicate to operate with relative impunity. But that wasn't the only surprising discovery we made. As we analyzed the financial trails of some of these online marketplaces, we found that some of them have ties to legitimate art galleries and auction houses. It appears that in some cases, these reputable institutions are unwittingly or even knowingly buying and selling fake artworks, often at inflated prices. This has significant implications for the art market as a whole, as it undermines the very foundation of trust and authenticity that it's built upon. But what's even more disturbing is that some of these galleries and auction houses may be actively involved in the creation and distribution of fake artworks, using their reputation and credibility to give these pieces a veneer of legitimacy. As we continued to investigate, we encountered a number of contradictory statements and confusing leads. Some experts we spoke to claimed that the Shadow Syndicate is a loose network of individual forgers, while others believed it's a highly organized and structured operation. But one thing that became clear is that the syndicate is using an array of sophisticated tactics to evade detection. For example, they're using encryption and secure communication channels to coordinate their activities, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to intercept and decode their messages. They're also using advanced digital tools to create fake provenances and documentation for their counterfeit pieces, often complete with fake certificates of authenticity and fake exhibition histories. But that wasn't the most surprising aspect of the Shadow Syndicate's operations. As we delved deeper, we found that they are also using social engineering tactics to manipulate and deceive art collectors and dealers. They're creating fake online personas and profiles, often posing as reputable art experts or collectors, to build trust and credibility with their marks. They're also using psychological manipulation to create a sense of urgency and exclusivity around their fake artworks, often claiming that they are rare or limited editions to justify inflated prices. It's a highly sophisticated and calculated approach, one that's designed to exploit the emotional and psychological vulnerabilities of their victims. As we analyzed the Shadow Syndicate's tactics and strategies, we began to notice a disturbing pattern. It appears that they're targeting not just individual collectors, but also institutions and museums. They're creating fake artworks that are specifically designed to appeal to these organizations, often using their knowledge of art historical trends and styles to create pieces that are convincing and persuasive. But what's even more alarming is that some of these institutions are actually buying and exhibiting these fake artworks, often without realizing it. This has significant implications for the art historical record, as it threatens to undermine our understanding of the past and our appreciation of genuine artworks. But the Shadow Syndicate's activities aren't just limited to the art world. As we continued to investigate, we found that they're also involved in a range of other illicit activities, from money laundering to organized crime. It appears that the syndicate is using the art market as a front for their other operations, often using the anonymity and secrecy of the art world to conceal their true activities. This has significant implications for law enforcement, as it means that they need to approach the problem of art forgery from a much broader perspective. They need to recognize that the Shadow Syndicate is not just a group of individual forgers, but a complex and multifaceted organization that's involved in a range of illicit activities. As we dug deeper, we encountered a number of surprising contradictions and paradoxes. For example, some of the individuals involved in the Shadow Syndicate are also involved in legitimate art historical and conservation activities. They're using their knowledge and expertise to create fake artworks, but they're also using it to restore and conserve genuine pieces. It's a strange and paradoxical situation, one that highlights the complexities and nuances of the art world. But what's even more surprising is that some of these individuals are actually using their involvement in the Shadow Syndicate to fund their legitimate activities. They're using the profits from their fake artworks to support their genuine artistic and historical pursuits. But that wasn't the most surprising discovery we made. As we analyzed the Shadow Syndicate's activities, we found that they are also involved in a range of other creative and cultural endeavors. They're producing fake literary and musical works, often using the same tactics and strategies that they use to create fake artworks. It appears that the syndicate is involved in a broader cultural and intellectual project, one that's designed to undermine and subvert our understanding of the past and our appreciation of genuine creative works. This has significant implications for our culture and society as a whole, as it threatens to undermine the very foundations of our intellectual and artistic heritage. As we continued to investigate, we encountered a number of challenging and complex questions. How can we distinguish between genuine and fake artworks, especially when the fakes are so convincing and persuasive? How can we prevent the Shadow Syndicate from continuing to operate and expand their activities? And how can we restore trust and confidence in the art market, especially when so many institutions and individuals have been deceived and manipulated? These are difficult and nuanced questions, ones that require a deep understanding of the art world and the Shadow Syndicate's activities. But what's even more challenging is that the syndicate is constantly evolving and adapting, often staying one step ahead of law enforcement and the art market. As we delved deeper into the world of the Shadow Syndicate, we found that their activities are not just limited to the art market. They're also involved in a range of other illicit activities, from counterfeiting to organized crime. It appears that the syndicate is using the art market as a front for their other operations, often using the anonymity and secrecy of the art world to conceal their true activities. This has significant implications for law enforcement, as it means that they need to approach the problem of art forgery from a much broader perspective. They need to recognize that the Shadow Syndicate is not just a group of individual forgers, but a complex and multifaceted organization that's involved in a range of illicit activities. But that wasn't the most surprising aspect of the syndicate's operations. As we continued to investigate, we found that they are also using their activities to fund and support other illicit endeavors, often with significant and far-reaching consequences. As we dug deeper into the syndicate's financial dealings, we discovered a complex web of offshore accounts, shell companies, and money laundering schemes. It became clear that the proceeds from the sale of forged artworks were being used to fund a wide range of illicit activities, from arms trafficking to human smuggling. But what was most alarming was the syndicate's ability to infiltrate and manipulate the legitimate art market, using their forged pieces to launder money and finance their other endeavors. The fact that they were able to do so with such ease and impunity raises serious questions about the effectiveness of current regulations and law enforcement efforts. But that wasn't the most disturbing aspect of the syndicate's operations. As we continued to investigate, we found that they were also using their forged artworks to influence the market and manipulate the prices of legitimate pieces. By creating fake artworks and attributing them to famous artists, they were able to artificially inflate the value of certain styles and periods, making it difficult for collectors and investors to determine what was real and what was fake. This not only undermined the integrity of the art market, but also had significant financial implications for those who had invested in legitimate artworks. The syndicate's ability to manipulate the market in such a way raises serious concerns about the stability of the art world and the potential for financial losses. As we delved deeper into the syndicate's activities, we encountered a number of contradictory statements and inconsistencies. Some experts claimed that the syndicate was a relatively small operation, while others believed it was a large and complex organization with tentacles reaching into every aspect of the art world. The fact that there was such disagreement about the syndicate's size and scope made it difficult to determine the full extent of their operations and the impact they were having on the art market. But one thing was certain: the syndicate was having a profound effect on the way people perceived and interacted with art, and their activities were raising important questions about the nature of authenticity and value in the art world. But what was perhaps most intriguing about the syndicate's operations was the way they seemed to be operating in plain sight. Despite the fact that they were engaging in illicit activities, they were able to do so with relative ease, often using their wealth and influence to avoid detection. The fact that they were able to operate with such impunity raises serious questions about the effectiveness of current law enforcement efforts and the willingness of governments to tackle the problem of art forgery. As we continued to investigate, we began to uncover evidence of a widespread conspiracy involving corrupt dealers, collectors, and even museum officials. The more we learned, the more it became clear that the syndicate was just the tip of the iceberg, and that the problem of art forgery was far more complex and deeply ingrained than we had initially suspected. As we pieced together the evidence, we began to see a pattern of deceit and corruption that reached to the very highest levels of the art world. The syndicate's activities were not just limited to creating and selling forged artworks, but also involved a sophisticated network of accomplices and co-conspirators who helped to authenticate and promote their fake pieces. The fact that so many people were involved in the syndicate's activities raises serious questions about the integrity of the art market and the willingness of those involved to prioritize profits over principle. But that wasn't the strangest part. As we dug deeper, we found that some of the most prominent figures in the art world were not only aware of the syndicate's activities, but were also actively involved in promoting and selling their forged artworks. The more we learned about the syndicate's activities, the more it became clear that their operations were not just limited to the art world. They were also involved in a wide range of other illicit activities, from money laundering to arms trafficking. The fact that they were able to operate with such ease and impunity raises serious questions about the effectiveness of current law enforcement efforts and the willingness of governments to tackle the problem of organized crime. As we continued to investigate, we began to uncover evidence of a global network of corrupt officials, businessmen, and criminals who were working together to facilitate the syndicate's activities. The sheer scale and complexity of the syndicate's operations were staggering, and it became clear that they were just one part of a much larger and more complex web of deceit and corruption. But what was perhaps most alarming about the syndicate's activities was the way they seemed to be using their forged artworks to fund and support other illicit endeavors. The fact that they were able to do so with such ease and impunity raises serious questions about the effectiveness of current regulations and law enforcement efforts. As we delved deeper into the syndicate's activities, we encountered a number of disturbing examples of how their forged artworks were being used to launder money and finance other illicit activities. The fact that so many people were involved in the syndicate's activities, and that they were able to operate with such ease and impunity, raises serious questions about the integrity of the art market and the willingness of those involved to prioritize profits over principle. As we approached the end of our investigation, we were left with more questions than answers. The syndicate's activities had raised serious concerns about the integrity of the art market, the effectiveness of current regulations and law enforcement efforts, and the willingness of governments to tackle the problem of organized crime. But perhaps the most pressing question of all was what would happen next. Would the syndicate be brought to justice, or would they continue to operate with impunity, using their forged artworks to fund and support their other illicit activities? The fact that so much was still unknown, and that the syndicate's activities were still shrouded in mystery, left us with a sense of unease and uncertainty, and a lingering question: what other secrets was the art world hiding, and how far did the syndicate's reach really extend? As we delved deeper into the world of international art forgery, it became clear that the Shadow Syndicate's reach was far more extensive than initially thought, with tendrils stretching into the highest echelons of the art market. Their ability to create flawless forgeries had allowed them to infiltrate even the most prestigious auction houses and galleries, often with the unwitting complicity of respected experts and collectors. But what was perhaps most alarming was the syndicate's apparent disregard for the integrity of the art historical record, as they seemed to be intentionally seeding the market with fake masterpieces, thereby corrupting the very fabric of our cultural heritage. This brazen manipulation of the art market raised fundamental questions about the nature of authenticity and the role of expertise in verifying the provenance of artworks. How could it be that seasoned experts, armed with the latest scientific techniques and a deep understanding of art history, were consistently being duped by these forgeries? The answer, it seemed, lay in the syndicate's sophisticated understanding of the art market's inherent vulnerabilities, particularly its reliance on connoisseurship and the subjective judgments of individual experts. By exploiting these weaknesses, the syndicate was able to create an aura of legitimacy around their forgeries, often by crafting elaborate backstories and fake provenances that were designed to deceive even the most discerning eye. But that wasn't the strangest part. As our investigation continued, we began to uncover evidence of a disturbing trend. Certain reputable dealers and collectors were not only aware of the syndicate's activities, but were also, in some cases, actively colluding with them. This shocking revelation raised the stakes, as it suggested that the problem of art forgery was not just a matter of rogue outsiders infiltrating the art market, but rather a symptom of a deeper rot that had taken hold within the very fabric of the art world itself. The fact that respected members of the art community were involved in, or at least turning a blind eye to, these illicit activities spoke to a profound crisis of ethics and integrity, one that threatened to undermine the entire edifice of the art market. One of the most significant challenges in exposing the Shadow Syndicate's activities was the sheer scale and complexity of their operations. With a global network of operatives and a sophisticated system of encrypted communication, the syndicate seemed to be always one step ahead of law enforcement and other would-be investigators. But as we dug deeper, we began to identify certain patterns and inconsistencies that suggested the syndicate's activities were not as seamless as they appeared. For example, a number of the forgeries that had been attributed to the syndicate seemed to bear an unusual resemblance to the work of a particular artist, one who had been active in the early 20th century and was known for his innovative use of materials and techniques. This raised an intriguing question. Was it possible that the syndicate had somehow managed to obtain access to the artist's original materials and techniques, or were they simply using their knowledge of art history to create clever pastiches? As we explored this line of inquiry further, we stumbled upon a fascinating contradiction. While the syndicate's forgeries were often remarkably convincing, they also seemed to be deliberately flawed in certain ways, as if the forgers were intentionally leaving behind a trail of clues for those who knew where to look. This was a puzzling phenomenon, as it seemed to suggest that the syndicate was playing a kind of cat-and-mouse game with their potential detractors, taunting them with hints of their true identities and methods. But what was the purpose of this game, and who exactly was the syndicate trying to communicate with? Was it a case of hubris, or was there something more sinister at play? The more we learned about the Shadow Syndicate's activities, the more we realized that their impact extended far beyond the rarefied world of high art. Their forgeries had become a kind of currency, used to launder money and fund a wide range of illicit activities, from arms dealing to human trafficking. This was a sobering reminder that the art market, for all its pretensions to elegance and refinement, was ultimately just another arena for the pursuit of power and profit. And yet, despite the gravity of these revelations, there were still many who seemed reluctant to confront the reality of the situation, preferring instead to cling to a romanticized vision of the art world as a rarefied realm of beauty and creativity. But the truth was far more complicated, and it was only by confronting the darker aspects of the art market that we could begin to understand the true extent of the Shadow Syndicate's reach. As our investigation continued, we encountered a number of individuals who had been affected by the Syndicate's activities, from collectors who had been duped into buying forgeries to artists who had seen their work copied and sold without their permission. These stories were a powerful reminder of the human cost of the Syndicate's actions, and they raised important questions about the responsibility of the art market to protect its participants and uphold the integrity of the artworks that passed through it. One of the most striking aspects of the Shadow Syndicate's operation was their use of advanced technology to create and distribute their forgeries. From 3D printing to digital manipulation, the Syndicate had clearly invested heavily in the latest tools and techniques, allowing them to produce fake artworks that were almost indistinguishable from the real thing. But as we delved deeper into the Syndicate's use of technology, we began to uncover evidence of a surprising contradiction. Despite their reliance on cutting-edge techniques, the Syndicate's forgeries often seem to be rooted in a deep understanding of traditional art historical methods and materials. This was a fascinating paradox, as it suggested that the Syndicate's members were not just tech-savvy entrepreneurs, but also knowledgeable art historians and conservators. As we struggled to make sense of this complex picture, we couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the art world was hiding. Were there other syndicates operating in the shadows, using their knowledge of art history and technology to create and distribute forgeries? And what about the role of law enforcement and regulatory agencies? Were they equipped to deal with the scale and sophistication of the Shadow Syndicate's activities? The more we learned, the more we realized that the problem of art forgery was just the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of a deeper crisis of trust and accountability that threatened to undermine the very foundations of the art market. But that wasn't the only question on our minds. As we dug deeper into the Syndicate's activities, we began to uncover hints of a larger conspiracy, one that seemed to involve not just the art market, but also other areas of the global economy. The Syndicate's use of shell companies, offshore bank accounts, and other financial instruments suggested that they were just one part of a much larger network, one that was dedicated to laundering money and evading taxes on a massive scale. This was a disturbing revelation, as it implied that the Shadow Syndicate's activities were not just a matter of art forgery, but also a symptom of a much broader disease, one that threatened to corrupt the entire global financial system. As the stakes continued to escalate, we found ourselves drawn into a complex web of intrigue and deception, one that seemed to stretch from the rarefied world of high art to the darkest recesses of the global underworld. The Shadow Syndicate's activities had created a kind of ripple effect, one that was disturbing the delicate balance of the art market and threatening to undermine the trust and confidence that were essential to its functioning. And yet, despite the gravity of the situation, there were still many who seemed reluctant to confront the reality of the Syndicate's activities, preferring instead to cling to a romanticized vision of the art world as a rarefied realm of beauty and creativity. The investigation was far from over, and as we continued to follow the trail of clues, we couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the art world was hiding. The Shadow Syndicate's activities had exposed a deep rot at the heart of the art market, one that threatened to undermine the entire edifice of the global art world. But as we delved deeper into the mystery, we began to realize that the truth was far more complex and nuanced, a tangled web of competing interests and motivations that seemed to defy easy explanation. The art world, it seemed, was a place of mystery and intrigue, where nothing was ever as it seemed, and the truth was always hiding in plain sight. As we navigated this labyrinthine world, we encountered a cast of characters who seemed to embody the very essence of deception. There were the master forgers, capable of crafting fake artwork so convincing that even the most discerning experts were duped. And then there were the dealers, who knowingly or unknowingly peddled these forgeries to unsuspecting collectors, often at astronomical prices. But what was striking was the sheer scale of the operation, with estimates suggesting that up to 20% of all artworks in circulation are forgeries. This staggering figure raises questions about the very foundations of the art market and whether the entire system is rotten to its core. But that wasn't the strangest part. As we delved deeper, we began to uncover a web of connections between the art world and the world of organized crime. It appeared that some of the most notorious crime syndicates had infiltrated the art market, using it as a means to launder money and fund their illicit activities. This was a shocking revelation, as it suggested that the art world was not just a victim of forgery, but also a willing participant in a much larger game of deception. The implications were profound and raised questions about the complicity of art dealers, collectors, and even museums in this vast network of crime. One of the most intriguing cases we came across was that of Eric Spouts, a notorious art forger who had managed to dupe some of the most prominent collectors and dealers in the world. His forgeries were so convincing that they had even been exhibited in major museums and had sold for millions of dollars. But what was remarkable about Spouts was not just his skill as a forger, but also his ability to evade detection for so long. He had created an elaborate network of fake identities and shell companies, which had allowed him to operate with impunity for years. And yet, despite his eventual capture and conviction, the full extent of his operation remains shrouded in mystery, leaving many to wonder how many more Spoutses are out there, waiting to be discovered. As we dug deeper, we began to realize that the art world's obsession with authenticity was itself a kind of fetish. The value of an artwork was often tied to its provenance, its historical significance, and its connection to a particular artist or movement. But this obsession with authenticity had also created a culture of secrecy and exclusivity, where collectors and dealers were willing to pay top dollar for artworks that were often nothing more than clever fakes. This was a curious contradiction, as the art world claimed to value truth and authenticity above all else, and yet it was willing to turn a blind eye to forgery and deception in pursuit of profit. And so, we were left to wonder whether the art world was truly committed to uncovering the truth, or whether it was simply more convenient to maintain the status quo. The more we learned, the more we began to appreciate the sheer complexity of the art market. It was a world of subtle nuances and gray areas, where the lines between truth and fiction were constantly blurred. And at the heart of this world were the art experts, the ones who were tasked with verifying the authenticity of artworks. But what we found was that even these experts were not immune to the influences of the market. Many of them had ties to the very dealers and collectors they were supposed to be regulating, and some had even been accused of taking bribes or kickbacks in exchange for their expertise. This was a shocking revelation, as it suggested that the entire system of art authentication was compromised, and that the trust that collectors and dealers placed in these experts was misplaced. What was even more disturbing was the way in which the art world seemed to be in denial about the scale of the problem. Despite the mounting evidence of forgery and deception, many in the art world continued to downplay the issue, or to suggest that it was limited to a few rogue dealers and collectors. And yet, the evidence we had uncovered suggested that the problem was far more widespread, and that it went all the way to the top of the art market. This was a curious phenomenon, as it seemed to suggest that the art world was more interested in maintaining its own mythology than in confronting the harsh realities of the market. And so, we were left to wonder whether the art world would ever be willing to confront the truth about itself, or whether it would continue to perpetuate its own myths and legends. As we continued our investigation, we came across a number of cases that seemed to defy explanation. There was the case of the fake Rothko, which had been sold to a prominent collector for millions of dollars. And then there was the case of the forged Warhol, which had been exhibited in a major museum without anyone noticing. These cases were striking, not just because of their brazenness, but also because of the ease with which they had been carried out. It seemed that the art world was a place where anything could be faked and where the truth was always up for grabs. And yet, despite the many questions that these cases raised, the art world seemed reluctant to confront the implications of what had happened. One of the most significant cases we encountered was that of the Beltracchi affair, in which a German art forger had managed to dupe some of the most prominent collectors and dealers in the world. The forger, Wolfgang Beltracchi, had created a series of fake artworks that were so convincing that they had even been attributed to some of the most famous artists of the 20th century. And yet, despite the fact that Beltracchi had been caught and convicted, the full extent of his operation remained shrouded in mystery. It was as if the art world was afraid to confront the truth about what had happened, and was instead content to sweep the whole affair under the rug. But that wasn't the strangest part. As we dug deeper, we began to realize that Beltracchi's forgeries had been just the tip of the iceberg, and that there were many more like him out there, waiting to be discovered. The more we learned, the more we began to appreciate the sheer audacity of the forgers. They were masters of manipulation, capable of creating fake artworks that were so convincing that even the most discerning experts were duped. And yet, despite their skill and cunning, they often seemed to be motivated by a desire for recognition and respect, rather than simply by greed. This was a curious contradiction, as it seemed to suggest that the forgers were driven by a desire to be part of the art world, rather than simply to exploit it. And so, we were left to wonder whether the art world was truly capable of distinguishing between the genuine and the fake, or whether it was simply a willing participant in a vast game of deception. As we delved deeper into the mystery, we began to encounter a number of characters who seemed to embody the very essence of the art world. There were the collectors, who were driven by a desire to possess the rare and the beautiful. And then there were the dealers, who were driven by a desire to make a profit. But what was striking was the way in which these characters seemed to be trapped in a web of their own making, unable to escape the cycle of deception and forgery that had become so ingrained in the art world. It was as if they were caught in a kind of feedback loop, where the desire for authenticity and the desire for profit had become inextricably linked. And so, we were left to wonder whether the art world would ever be able to break free from this cycle, or whether it would continue to perpetuate its own myths and legends. The art world's response to the crisis of forgery has been curious, to say the least. On the one hand, there have been efforts to increase transparency and regulation, with many dealers and collectors calling for greater scrutiny of artworks and their provenance. And yet, on the other hand, there seems to be a reluctance to confront the full extent of the problem, with many in the art world downplaying the scale of the issue or suggesting that it is limited to a few rogue dealers and collectors. This is a curious contradiction, as it seems to suggest that the art world is torn between a desire to maintain its own mythology and a desire to confront the harsh realities of the market. And so, we are left to wonder whether the art world will ever be able to reconcile these competing desires, or whether it will continue to perpetuate its own myths and legends. As we continued our investigation, we came across a number of cases that seemed to illustrate the complexities of the art market. There was the case of the disputed Pollock, which had been sold to a prominent collector for millions of dollars. And then there was the case of the fake Picasso, which had been exhibited in a major museum without anyone noticing. These cases were striking, not just because of their brazenness, but also because of the way in which they seemed to highlight the flaws in the art world system of authentication. It seemed that the art world was a place where anything could be faked, and where the truth was always up for grabs. And yet, despite the many questions that these cases raised, the art world seemed reluctant to confront the implications of what had happened. One of the most significant challenges facing the art world is the issue of provenance, or the history of an artwork's ownership. In many cases, the provenance of an artwork is unclear or incomplete, making it difficult to determine its authenticity. And yet, despite the importance of provenance, many in the art world seem reluctant to prioritize it, preferring instead to focus on the artwork's aesthetic or monetary value. This is a curious phenomenon, as it seems to suggest that the art world is more interested in maintaining its own mythology than in confronting the harsh realities of the market. And so, we are left to wonder whether the art world will ever be able to reconcile its desire for authenticity with its desire for profit, or whether it will continue to perpetuate its own myths and legends. The more we learned, the more we began to appreciate the sheer complexity of the art market. It was a world of subtle nuances and gray areas, where the lines between truth and fiction were constantly blurred. And at the heart of this world were the art experts, the ones who were tasked with verifying the authenticity of artworks. But what we found was that even these experts were not immune to the influences of the market. Many of them had ties to the very dealers and collectors they were supposed to be regulating, and some had even been accused of taking bribes or kickbacks in exchange for their expertise. This was a shocking revelation, as it suggested that the entire system of art authentication was compromised, and that the trust that collectors and dealers placed in these experts was misplaced. As we navigated this complex web of relationships and interests, we began to realize that the art world was a place of mystery and intrigue where nothing was ever as it seemed. The truth was always hiding in plain sight, and the art world seemed to be in a constant state of denial about the scale of the problem. And yet, despite the many challenges and contradictions that we encountered, we remained convinced that the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. The question was, would the art world ever be willing to confront it, or would it continue to perpetuate its own myths and legends? But that wasn't the strangest part. As we dug deeper, we began to uncover a web of connections between the art world and the world of organized crime, a connection that seemed to go all the way to the top of the art market. The art world's connection to organized crime was a revelation that sent shockwaves through our investigation, as we discovered that some of the most respected dealers and collectors were, in fact, tied to notorious crime families. It seemed that the lucrative nature of the art market had made it an attractive front for money laundering and other illicit activities. But what was even more astonishing was the level of sophistication and brazenness with which these crimes were being committed. For instance, we found that some forgers were using advanced technology to create fake masterpieces, complete with artificial aging and distressing to make them appear centuries old. But that wasn't the most alarming part. It was the fact that some of these forgeries were being sold to unsuspecting collectors and museums, with price tags in the millions. As we delved deeper into the world of art forgery, we began to notice a pattern of inconsistency in the way that artworks were being authenticated. It appeared that some experts were willing to turn a blind eye to obvious red flags, or even actively participate in the deception. We spoke to several sources who claimed that certain auction houses were knowingly selling forgeries, and that some dealers were even creating their own fake provenances to make their artworks appear more valuable. But what was the motivation behind this widespread corruption? Was it simply a matter of greed, or was there something more complex at play? One thing was certain: the art world's reputation was on the line, and it seemed that the truth was being deliberately obscured. But that wasn't the only contradiction we encountered as we dug deeper. We found that some of the most vocal critics of art forgery were themselves implicated in the scandal. The more we learned, the more we realized that the art world was a complex web of relationships and alliances, with players on all sides hiding behind a veil of secrecy. We discovered that some of the most prominent art dealers and collectors were also major donors to museums and art institutions, and that these institutions were often willing to overlook questionable provenances in order to acquire high-profile artworks. It seemed that the desire for prestige and status was outweighing the need for authenticity and transparency. But what about the role of law enforcement in all of this? Were they aware of the extent of the problem? And if so, why weren't they doing more to crack down on art forgery? We spoke to several investigators who claimed that they were hindered by a lack of resources and expertise, and that the art world's culture of secrecy made it difficult to gather evidence. But that didn't explain why some high-profile cases of art forgery seemed to be swept under the rug, with perpetrators receiving little more than a slap on the wrist. As we continued to investigate, we began to uncover a trail of clues that suggested the problem of art forgery went far beyond a few rogue dealers and collectors. It seemed that the entire system was rigged, with fake artworks being created and sold on a massive scale. We found that some online marketplaces were allowing sellers to peddle obvious forgeries with little or no scrutiny. And it wasn't just the art world that was being affected. We discovered that the proceeds from art forgery were being used to fund other illicit activities, such as terrorism and organized crime. The stakes were much higher than we had initially thought, and it seemed that the art world was just the tip of the iceberg. But how far did this conspiracy go, and who was ultimately behind it? We were determined to find out, but every door we tried to open seemed to lead to a dead end. But that wasn't the most frustrating part. It was the fact that some of the people we spoke to seemed to be hiding something, and that the truth was being deliberately obscured. The deeper we dug, the more we realized that the art world was a microcosm of a much larger problem, a problem of corruption and deceit that seemed to permeate every level of society. We discovered that some of the most respected institutions in the art world were themselves implicated in the scandal, and that the problem of art forgery was just one symptom of a much larger disease. It seemed that the pursuit of power and profit had become the primary motivator, with integrity and ethics taking a back seat. But what about the artists themselves? Were they aware of the fact that their work was being forged and sold on the black market? And if so, what were they doing to stop it? We spoke to several artists who claimed that they had been victims of art forgery and that they had been powerless to stop it. But that raised another question: if the artists themselves were being exploited, then who was ultimately benefiting from the scam? The answers, it seemed, lay in the shadows, and it would take a lot more digging to uncover them. As we continued to investigate, we began to notice a pattern of strange coincidences and unexplained events. It seemed that some of the key players in the art world were connected to each other in ways that couldn't be explained by mere coincidence. We discovered that some of the most prominent art dealers and collectors were also major players in the world of finance and politics, and that they seemed to be using their influence to shape the art market to their advantage. But what was the ultimate goal of this manipulation? Was it simply a matter of accumulating wealth and power, or was there something more sinister at play? The more we learned, the more we realized that the art world was just one small part of a much larger game, a game of global manipulation and control. And it seemed that the truth was being deliberately obscured, hidden behind a veil of secrecy and deception. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. It was the fact that the art world seemed to be just a small part of a much larger web of corruption, a web that seemed to ensnare everyone from politicians to businessmen to ordinary citizens. The further we delved into the world of art forgery, the more we realized that the problem was not just limited to the art world. It seemed that the corruption and deceit that we had uncovered were just symptoms of a much larger disease, a disease of greed and corruption that seemed to permeate every level of society. We discovered that some of the same players who were involved in the art forgery scandal were also involved in other illicit activities, such as money laundering and arms dealing. And it seemed that the art world was just one small part of a much larger network of corruption, a network that seemed to stretch from the highest echelons of power to the lowest depths of the underworld. But how far did this network stretch, and who was ultimately behind it? The answers, it seemed, lay in the shadows, hidden behind a veil of secrecy and deception. But that wasn't the most alarming part. It was the fact that the corruption seemed to be so widespread, so ingrained in the fabric of society, that it seemed almost impossible to root out. As we continued to investigate, we began to realize that the art world was just a small part of a much larger machine, a machine that seemed to be driven by greed, corruption, and deceit. We discovered that some of the most respected institutions in the art world were themselves implicated in the scandal, and that the problem of art forgery was just one symptom of a much larger disease. It seemed that the pursuit of power and profit had become the primary motivator, with integrity and ethics taking a back seat. But what about the role of the media in all of this? Were they aware of the extent of the problem? And if so, why weren't they doing more to expose it? We spoke to several journalists who claimed that they had been silenced or intimidated by powerful forces, and that the truth was being deliberately obscured. But that raised another question: if the media was being manipulated, then who was ultimately behind the manipulation? The answers, it seemed, lay in the shadows, hidden behind a veil of secrecy and deception. The more we learned, the more we realized that the art world was just one small part of a much larger game, a game of global manipulation and control. And it seemed that the truth was being deliberately obscured, hidden behind a veil of secrecy and deception. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. It was the fact that the art world seemed to be just a small part of a much larger web of corruption, a web that seemed to ensnare everyone from politicians to businessmen to ordinary citizens. We discovered that some of the same players who were involved in the art forgery scandal were also involved in other illicit activities, such as money laundering and arms dealing. And it seemed that the art world was just one small part of a much larger network of corruption, a network that seemed to stretch from the highest echelons of power to the lowest depths of the underworld. But how far did this network stretch, and who was ultimately behind it? The answers, it seemed, lay in the shadows, hidden behind a veil of secrecy and deception. As we neared the end of our investigation, we couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden in the shadows. The art world, it seemed, was just the tip of the iceberg, a small part of a much larger machine that seemed to be driven by greed, corruption, and deceit. And it seemed that the truth was being deliberately obscured, hidden behind a veil of secrecy and deception. But we were determined to expose it, no matter how far we had to dig. The art world, it seemed, was just the beginning, a small part of a much larger journey into the heart of darkness. And as we emerged from the shadows, we